Can you point a handgun at someone in Wyoming if they don't have a gun? This is Christina Williams with Just Criminal Law.
And David Mann, legal storytelling specialist. Well, that really does sound like the start of a good story. So I'm assuming you can't do that, but tell us more about that.
Well, actually, it depends. It depends on the situation. And there's a Supreme Court case out of Wyoming, Drennan v. the state of Wyoming, where the Supreme Court outlined just exactly what has to happen in order for an armed person to point a gun at an unarmed person and claim self-defense.
So they've made a determination on this, and how did they make that determination?
Sure. So in this particular case, we had a landlord who owned a trailer park, and the landlord wanted to have the tenant who was not paying leave. However, the tenant was being stubborn, refused to take his trailer and leave, and refused to pay. And so the landlord went to the tenant's trailer and was going to post a no trespassing sign on the deck of the landlord, just essentially telling the tenant, you're no longer allowed here, you're officially trespassing. Well, this angered the tenant, and the tenant pushed the landlord off of the deck, and the landlord fell, hit his head pretty hard, and the tenant rushed off the deck and toward the landlord and indicated, hey, I'm going to kill you. He used those words to some extent or some degree, but threatened to kill him. And the landlord ended up shooting the tenant and had to stand trial for murder.
Wow. Okay. That really is a story. So he stands trial for murder, but you just said a minute ago that this situation is not nearly as clear-cut as that, and the Supreme Court made some determination off this case, right?
Right. So the prosecutor argued that in Wyoming, you can't shoot an unarmed man. He said that's the law. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not the law, and they reversed that conviction and made it go back to the trial court. Now, in this particular situation, what is noteworthy is that there was a violent confrontation. That is, the tenant pushed the landlord so hard that he ended up hitting his head. Now, that's in most situations concerning you hitting your head hard on the ground, falling off of a deck, could definitely result in serious bodily injury. And then he made the threat that he was going to kill the landlord. So those three things put the landlord in reasonable fear of death or serious bodily injury. And so because the jury should be allowed to determine if that's in fact reasonable under these circumstances, and wasn't given that opportunity, the prosecutor said you just can't do that. And it's a case-by-case basis, but it definitely depends, would a reasonable person in his situation have that fear? And that should be allowed if a jury determines, yes, that was reasonable and he could defend himself with force and as much as deadly force.
Yeah, so I think to sort of summarize that, we usually think of it as being like a weapon equals a weapon. And if someone has a weapon and someone doesn't have a weapon, that's unequal. But in this case, this guy was a weapon just by virtue of the fact that he was being pushy, literally, and using that kind of language. So that sort of constitutes he is armed in a sense. Is that how the law looks at it?
Exactly. You don't have to have a weapon if the circumstances are threatening enough. They'll take into consideration the size of the individuals even. Sometimes whether one of the individuals was a male and one of the individuals was a female. So a lot of factors come into play in deciding whether or not an armed person can shoot an unarmed person.
All right. So these are legal sort of knowledge that people don't necessarily have, and they're going to have to come to a lawyer to find out how this is going to go in their case, how would they get in touch with you?
Sure, we'll include a link in the description where they can call, text, or chat with a member of my team anytime, day or night. Here at Just Criminal Law, we know you only get one shot at justice, so make yours count.